Hi everyone, today I'm going to talk about depression, my experience with the mental health system in the UK, and why I'm annoyed with how my depression episode was dealt with by the mental health professionals. Just want to say before we start that I am not a mental health professional, and this is not supposed to be an episode with advice for you on how to treat your mental health. If you have some sort of mental health illness or suspect that you do, I recommend you go and see a qualified mental health professional for that.
This is a Deep Psychology podcast. I'm your host, Ross Edwards, writer, meditation teacher, founder of deep-psychology.com, and avid lover of all things psychological. In listening to this podcast, you're part of the worldwide deep psychology community of tens of thousands of people undertaking profound personal transformation. You can join us on any of the major podcasting platforms, and make sure to visit the site deep-psychology.com for lots of high quality resources. Let's get started.
I also want to say on a different note that I've just created a Patreon account. So if you really like this podcast and you want to support me in what I do, this is my full-time job, not just the podcast, but the website. This is my full-time job, and any extra support with it is really very much appreciated. So please head to my Patreon page and contribute if you like what I do and you want to continue helping me to make this podcast. So I want to say before we begin that this episode might seem a bit negative, and it might seem like I'm just ranting about why I dislike the medical system without offering any real solutions. I feel like that's quite a common thing with people who hold certain political views and certain views of how medicine should work and all that. They sort of complain a lot about the status quo, but they don't really offer any solutions, and in their own life they don't necessarily live the very solutions that they themselves would advocate. And I don't want this to come across as a rant with no end, with no goal behind it. My goal here is to share my mental health experiences, both as a patient and as and it's to ultimately next week I'm going to create an episode about developing a more integral understanding of depression, a more integral way of treating depression, based on my opinion, my experience as a meditator and so on. And so it's going to be informative. It might at some point seem like a therapy session for me, because I'm going to explain my experience with depression and how it was treated. And yes, I'm going to be ranting a little bit. I think these are very serious issues, and they do have solutions. I'm not just sitting here pie in the sky imagining like some sort of overly idealistic medical system. These things are out there. They're just not very well known about, and they're up and coming. And I do practice, for example, meditation. I do practice and teach meditation, and I write about it. So I'm not just sitting here, on my feeling idealistic and, all hurt about my experiences and sort of ranting without offering a solution. I'm offering a solution. Just be patient and we're going to get to the solution. So let me just sort of sum up the episode, just so I can give you a framework for it before we dive into all the nitty-gritty. So basically, what I'm going to talk about is why I'm annoyed with the mental health, the way mental health is viewed and how it's treated and so on, mental health issues. And basically the crux of it is that mental health is treated in a very disempowering way. I'll get into the nitty-gritty details of that. It's treated in a way that makes you feel like a sort of victim. It makes you feel like you need to be helped by other people. It makes you feel like you are that there's something sort of wrong with you that needs to be cured, right? And I understand that has some validity, but I also think that it's actually very disempowering, and I experienced this firsthand, and so I can say that very honestly. And one thing we're going to talk about in detail is the fact that at no point in the whole process of my treatment, which lasted 9 to 12 months, I can't really remember exactly, 9 to 12 months, at no point did any of the mental health professionals that I was dealing with, at no point did any of them sort of sit me down and say, this is why I think you're depressed. This is how you are this is how I don't think I would have been ready to hear that I was perpetuating it myself, but it would have been accurate. This is how your psychology is influencing it. This is how your psychology is sort of interpreting it, and this is how you're contributing to it, and this is what you can do to get out of it. Literally at no point in the process, and this is the main thing I'm pissed off about, if you can tell by the tone of my voice, at no point in the process did anyone say that to me. No, I'm being serious, not even the therapists that I went to see. At no point did they say anything like that to me. So we're going to talk about the problems with that and how we might approach it. But that, I don't know, make up your own mind, right? And you can make up your own mind when I'm talking about this later on, but it's just, it makes no sense to me. Like, I honestly, it doesn't make any sense to me whatsoever. It leaves me lost for words, to be honest. So that's another thing that I'm annoyed about. And I guess I'm just annoyed about how people view depression in general and how people view mental health, and how the medical system perpetuates our very strange perspectives on mental health and how it works. So that's sort of, in summary, what we're going to talk about. What we're going to do now, though, is go back to 2014, which is when I experienced my depressive episode, or the main part of it. Now listen, actually, before 2014, before I was a university student, this was when I was a university student, I had actually, in my teens, it's hard to say, because in your teens, you're going through a lot of upheaval, biological, psychological, social, you've got pressures at school, you're thinking about your future when, you haven't really got much life experience, you've not done very much. It's a challenging time as a teenager, and so ups and downs in mood are quite normal. So I'm not going to say I was like depressed necessarily, but I can see that a lot of the emotional and psychological problems I had in my teens were sort of never really addressed, and that they definitely fed into my most severe episode of depression when I was 19 in 2014. So let's go back to 2014, as I was saying, and let's go to the summer. This was after the first year of my university degree, and I was living at home and I was working in McDonald's at the time. I spent 2 years working in McDonald's during university. And in the summer, I was actually doing about 30 hours a week, I remember. And I had just broken up. I had been broken up, should I say, by a girl who I was really enamored with at the time. I didn't, when you're experiencing love, especially when you're young, and I'd experienced it before and I sort of knew what it was about, but I sort of knew, but I also didn't know. Like, I couldn't look at it and say, this is love. I'm falling in love here. This is what it is. I wasn't able to see that. I was just being broken up with someone that I was very enamored with, and it was a very intense experience. The whole thing only lasted a few months, and I messed it up in the end, and it all came grinding to a halt. But it was interesting because I had girlfriends before, but I'd never felt the intensity of the emotion that I felt towards this girl. I'd seriously never felt it before. It was very intense. Like when I was with her, it felt like I was high. It felt like I could fly. It felt like I could conquer the world. I remember honestly thinking to myself, if we're together in the future, we can conquer the world together. Like I actually had those thoughts. Like, it felt like a chemical high. And then when I was not with her, I would sort of experience the afterglow of that. I'd also experience the sort of hangover and the sort of feeling of separation. And I'd also feel a deep yearning to be with her again. And we'd spend days and days and days together. And we're not living together, we're obviously teenagers, we're not living together, but we managed to spend days and days and days together non-stop. And I just never wanted to be without her. So that was basically my life. I would go out with my friends, I'd spend time with her, I'd go to my job. That was my summer. That was it. It was fun. However, when the breakup happened, it hit me very hard. Looking back, it hit me very, very hard, and I'm not going to sit here and cry about it, but it still feels like tender to me in a way. It feels like a scar is there. Even though obviously it was over 10 years ago now, and it's long gone, like long gone. I've not seen this girl for nearly a decade now, not seen her at all, not even, at a distance. I literally live in a different country now. It's long gone, it's in my past, but still like a sort of tenderness there when I think about it. It hit me very hard. Like I remember just a few hours after the breakup, I remember having this feeling of like, what is my life about now? I felt very confused. I felt like lost. I felt like this deep sense of separation. I remember over the weeks that went by after that, I'd be going to my work, I'd be working all these hours at work, and I couldn't stop thinking about her, and I just wanted to message her. I just wanted her to message me. I just wanted to see her. I just wanted things to be okay again. I just wanted, I just wanted her to come and say, forget it. I didn't really want to break up with you. Let's get back together. Everything's okay. And I remember even, being in my bedroom and thinking, she's going to knock at the door right now. She's just going to pull up in a taxi and she's going to knock at my door, and then, it's going to be like the old days again. So I was really, I was going through the standard breakup process, but I was really feeling it big time. I remember one of the ways I had of coping with it was basically drinking. Like, I started drinking a lot. Like I said, I used to drink quite a lot anyway, but it got to the stage where I was drinking as much as I could. Like, if I wasn't working the next day, I'd be drinking. If I was working the next day, I would be drinking, not quite as much, but I'd probably be drinking, even if I was just at home. Yes, that happened. I remember actually, I literally drank that summer after the breakup. I drank 27 days in a row. I'm not joking here about the numbers. 27 days in a row I drank. Now listen, if you've known someone who's a proper alcoholic, that might not seem a lot of days, right? But I was 19 years old. That is a lot. That is a lot. And it had effects on me. Like, I was not, it had, biological effects on me, illness. It was not good. And so yeah, I was feeling pretty terrible, and it was a struggle for me that summer. It was a big struggle after the breakup. And I remember being at work one day doing like a very menial task. I mean, listen, I was working at McDonald's, most of it is menial, but I was doing a particularly menial task. I remember standing and doing it, and at that moment, because my attention wasn't really taken up with what I was doing, listen, I've got quite a fertile imagination. I'm always thinking about lots of things, but not just, I'm always thinking about, I don't know, my life and, I don't know, lofty topics. I remember sort of zooming out on my life when I was doing this menial task, and I was just like, I had this moment of like, what are you doing with your life? Like, what are you doing with your life? And I remember seeing it all as like this big disaster. I'd just broken up with my girlfriend. I was drinking all the time. I was working McDonald's. Like, what am I doing working McDonald's? No offense to people who work in fast food restaurants. Like, serious, that is not an easy job. And it's not a pleasant job at all. But I was like, why am I doing it? I don't need to be doing this. I'm doing a degree. Why am I working McDonald's? I should be doing something better with my life. What am I doing with my life? I remember like all of the emotion from the past weeks just came up, and I just burst into tears right there, right then. And nothing like that had ever really happened to me before. Obviously, I'd cried plenty of times before. I'm quite a sensitive guy. I think all guys are under the surface, by the way, but I don't have as big a surface as other people, perhaps. It all came to the fore, and I remember sort of crying on shift, like really crying. I was crying for about 15, 20 minutes, like heavy crying. I went to the toilet, and I was like letting rip. I was really crying. And at that point, I realized like something clicked within me. I was like, there's something really wrong here. Like, this isn't just, I know I've broken up with the girl, but this isn't just like breakup blues that last for a few weeks, and there's nothing, you are a bit upset and whatever, but it was really starting to affect my life, this whole thing. And I could see that I couldn't see it with the clarity that I would be able to see it now, but then I even realized then that I was running circles in my head all the time, very negative mental circles. And so I took to the internet basically, and I started looking up the symptoms of depression on the internet, and turned out that my symptoms it looked like they were pretty serious. And that inspired me to go and see a doctor. And so I went to see the doctor, and sort of usual little interview, asking me about my life and asking me how I was feeling. It only lasted 5 or 10 minutes. It was a bit robotic. It was a bit like, I don't know, I didn't feel a lot of emotional warmth. I felt like I could have done with some at the time, and I didn't feel like that was happening. I felt like she was just sort of tick the boxes, and give me a diagnosis. We're going to talk about that after I talk about my story. And yeah, she sent me a prescription for an antidepressant. I can't remember what it is, but one of the common ones. And yeah, there I was. I remember sitting outside a pharmacy with my prescription slip, waiting for the prescription to be prepared. I remember just sitting like, shit, I've actually been diagnosed with depression. Very strange experience. I was 19, and I don't get ill often, and I don't go to the doctors. Even sometimes when I should go, I don't go. I'm just not that kid. I've not really got a lot of experience with the medical system until that point. Just being diagnosed with something that serious was a bit of a strange experience for me. It was a bit of like a shock. So yeah, it was a strange day, that being diagnosed with it. And from that point on, I felt like it just got worse. Over the course of the next month or 2 months, things just got worse and worse, because not only did I feel bad about the breakup and about my life at the time, and I was drinking, not only that, but I actually now felt like a depressed person. I was like, I'm actually a depressed person now. That's literally what I was saying to myself. I wasn't saying to myself, I've been diagnosed with an illness that is curable and that it's very widespread, and that, there's standard psychological treatments, and there's a reason for these things and all this. I didn't have the perspective and the knowledge then that I do now. I started, and in retrospect, what I started doing is I started acting like a depressed person would act. And we're going to talk about this in a minute. I started acting according to all the beliefs that I had about depression. I started acting according to what people had told me about depression. I started acting according to things I'd read on the internet about depression and what depressed people experience. So it actually just got worse. With the medication, it didn't get better. I'm not blaming the medication. I'm more blaming the diagnosis. And I'm blaming sort of my own lack of understanding about the topic, which we'll also get to. It got worse and worse. And when I went back to uni, and when I started seeing her every day, because we knew each other through university, it just got worse. Again, it got worse. Because I kept seeing her every day, I could see that, we're close to each other, kind of. We're on the same course, we're in the same lecture theatres every day. But I couldn't speak to her. I didn't know what to say. I felt abandoned. I felt like she didn't care. I still really, at this point it was probably sort of toxic, because I was like, who knows what she thought, but I would have loved to be back with her, but I also knew that it probably wasn't the right thing. It felt like we were a million miles away from each other. And part of me knew that we were never going to get back together. And we never did get back together. And we never spoke to each other ever again. But anyway, that was a detour. It got worse and worse because I kept seeing her every day, and I was still working at McDonald's, and I was still drinking all the time. And I remember one night, it all came to the fore again, but worse than the first time when I was working. We went out to a nightclub, my friends and I was trying to live my life normally. I was going to my university classes, even though oftentimes I really did not want to go, and that is not me. I am very keen to learn always, and I was always keen to go to university, and I actually enjoyed it. I didn't want to go to university really. Half me did, half me didn't, but I just forced myself to keep in a routine because I felt like it was keeping me going. So as part of that, I'd still go out nightclubbing, I'd still go out, socially drinking and so on. Looking back, probably wasn't the best idea, but I feel like I needed a sense of normality. We went out to that nightclub, and she was there. The girl, my ex-girlfriend, was there. And there was something about that just really set me off that night. I did not enjoy the night at all, because as soon as I arrived, I saw her and I knew she was there the whole time. I didn't speak to her, couldn't approach her, didn't want to. I felt scared. Felt like she didn't care about me. So I stayed away from her. And even though we were in the same nightclub and it wasn't a huge place, and I knew she was close to me, but I felt like I was a million miles away from her. And seeing her in public and, outside of university and outside of other people, really, I could have gone up and spoken to her. We could have talked, but I didn't want to. And knowing that just made the whole thing worse, because I've really started to realize, wow, this is really done, isn't it? And I won't go into details about this, but basically I went home and I was not in a good state of mind at all. And for some reason, I was drunk, my inhibitions were down. I was in a dark emotional state, particularly that night. And basically I had a suicide attempt that night. And I ended up in hospital, and I spent the next day or so in hospital recovering. It was a fairly simple, cure, but it got that serious. However, interestingly, I remember sort of perspective shift happened over the course of those days that I was in hospital. I actually felt light. I felt free and very light. And I remember I had this particular experience when I was in hospital, which will always stay with me because it sort of points me to where I am now in my life and what I'm doing. professionally and so on, is I remember walking to the toilet and I had a drip in me. So I had like the drip tower. I don't know what you call it. I'm just going to call it a drip tower. And it was on wheels, and I was walking in my hospital gown and I had it in my arm and I was pushing it along. I was walking to the toilet. I had like this moment of realization where I'm not going to call it an out of body experience, but kind of an out of body experience. It was just like I gained this remarkable sense of clarity that I'd been sorely missing for the last few months because I was drunk all the time while I was miserable. I remember suddenly I was sort of looking at myself. I wasn't looking at myself in the mirror. I was sort of I was just in my body, seeing the world and myself as normal. I remember just sort of seeing it. It was like seeing it from a distance now. And I remember saying to myself, or knowing very deeply and saying it to myself inside. I remember, saying, Ross, you're ill. Like, wow, you're ill. Like, look at what's going through your mind all the time. Look at what you're doing. Look at your behaviour. Look at your behaviour pattern. You're in hospital because you've had a suicide attempt. Like, you really need to change. But it was very loving. It was a very loving voice, but it was a very firm voice. It was like a very loving parent who's saying something to their child that, not to condemn them or to judge them, but just to tell them how things are from the words of someone who's lived through more life than the child has. I had this very strong sense like, Ross, you are ill. Like, you are ill. You need to do something about this. And from that moment on, I remember feeling very happy and very free. I actually remember I got my parents to bring my university materials to the hospital so I could sit and study all day, because that's what I wanted to do. Never admitted that to anyone, by the way. But something shifted in me that day, and I think it sort of went underground a little bit, but it remained in me a little bit. It's sort of part of me having such a strong experience and having that sort of wild desire to try and carry out something like that really put life in perspective for me. Not to sort of minimize life, but to say, this is life. This is your life. This is it. There is no other life. A big perspective shift happened. And from that day, I think everything was easier for me. I still kept going to therapy. I still was on my medicine, and I still had bad days, and I was still fragile, and I was still a bit lost, and I was still hurting over the breakup and everything. But I think from that day on, it helped. It almost felt like a purge of something. I don't know. I've not quite figured that out yet. So basically from then, things got easier, as I said. And about 6 to 9 months later, I stopped my medication. About 3 months later, I stopped going to my therapy. I just felt like I didn't need it anymore. It was therapy that I received from the university. It was sort of talk type therapy, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. And over the course of the next 6 to 9 months, eventually I basically took myself off my depression medication because I just felt like I didn't need it. I felt like I'd developed new habits in my life. I'd left behind some friendships. I'd built some new habits. I was going to the gym. I was eating better. I'd quit my job at McDonald's. I was making sort of exterior changes that were making me happier and living a healthier life. And since then, I've discovered meditation and so on, and I've got now the psychological tools. I still have difficult days because, I work for myself and I run my own business, and it's not easy sometimes. I'm not at all saying I'm depressed or anything, not at all. What I'm saying is when I have emotional troubles, I'm much more equipped now. I understand it from a greater perspective. Even if it's just a bad day or whatever, I can see it now. And I know myself very well, and I know my psychology and how it works. And so I'm in the position to manage bad days without them spiraling out of control like they might have done in the past. But So yeah, I've never really experienced depression like I have, like I did then. You know, I've had, as I said, I've had short periods of time where I've not been myself and so on, but nothing like that. And that's pretty much my experience with it. Now, you might look at this and you might think, well, Ross, you recovered. You know, you only had one bout of major depression in your life. What have you got to complain about? You know, you received treatment right away. You got your antidepressants. You got your therapy at university, which was free. I forgot to add that. It was free therapy at university. What are you moaning about? Well, that is a fair point. It's something I ask myself, you know, what am I moaning about here? You know, in retrospect, I did get cured, right? Well, true, but experiencing the mental health system as a patient was very eye-opening. And after studying psychology and doing meditation and teaching meditation and writing about these topics for many years now, it's shown a light on how the medical system works and how certain parts of it are very dysfunctional and how I experienced some pretty dysfunctional mental health care, in my opinion. So what are the main things that stuck out to me in that experience about the mental health system? If we go right to the point where I first had contact with it, which was when I went to the doctors to get a diagnosis. Well, before that, when I was on the internet looking around, but I can't really, you know, that was just information I was looking up. The first thing that stuck out for me at the time was the doctor was like so keen to get a diagnosis. Like I could feel at the time when I was in the meeting, and I was only 19 at the time, I felt like they were so keen to get a diagnosis on me. You know, it was like, let me try and get these boxes checked. You know, there's 5 or 10 points that together would constitute a depression diagnosis. So let me try and tick them off, and then I can get the medication prescribed, and then I can get the next patient in. That's how it felt to me at the time. And looking back, it's a very dysfunctional way of treating it. Now, listen, with some things, diagnoses are kind of obvious and natural, and they're perfectly fine. Like if you break your arm, it's quite obvious that you've broken your arm. You can look at an X-ray and you can say, well, the doctor can look at an X-ray and say, well, there's a broken arm there, I can see it. You know, let's get a cast on it, the person has to rest for 6 weeks or whatever, we might need to do an operation. It's quite obvious, right? So it's a broken arm. The thing is with mental health is that it's a different thing. You cannot, in my opinion, approach it from the same methodology, because in my opinion, and I mentioned this earlier, the way you view yourself and the way that you view the illness that you've been diagnosed with has a huge impact. And I don't have the psychological data right now to back this up. I can tell you as a patient, I can tell you as someone who's studied psychology for a long time, that it has an enormous impact. When someone goes to the doctor and they think they have depression, they also carry a whole slew of beliefs and experiences and ideas and cultural conditioning as to what depression is. And so they have certain beliefs about how a depressed person acts, what they think, what they feel, what they look like, how they walk, how they talk. You know, what is a depressed person? What does a depressed person look like? They've got that in their mind. And when you tell them you're depressed or you've got depression, they don't say it like that, but you know what I mean. Immediately that person, and I could see this so clearly in myself, that they start acting according to the diagnosis. They don't act according to life and what life, you know, they don't act as they would normally act. if they didn't know they had depression, they might be experiencing a lot of the symptoms. So I'm not denying the symptoms. What I'm saying is that when you put them in that box, they start acting like it. It's like when, it's like people from a certain country have certain customs, and they have certain habits, and they eat certain food, and they talk a certain way because they're from that country. It's not really a personal choice that they've had. It's just something that they've inherited and that they've reinforced through behavior and through the fact of living in that country. The same thing, in my opinion, and I'm not going to say I've got direct psychological data that proves exactly what I'm saying, but there's plenty of evidence out there about how conditioning works, about how we reinforce our self-image, about and so on and so on and so on, about how depression works. I think depression, in many ways, your experience of it is very molded by your ideas about it. So when you say to someone, you've got depression, immediately you trigger the person's program for depression. They might have never suffered it before, but they've got this whole thing, they've got this whole belief system about it, and they just turn into the person that they believe that they should be, according to the diagnosis, right? So immediately you are worsening the condition, because as I said, they're no longer living their life. They're no longer just, as I said, they might be experiencing the symptoms, but they're not living as normal. They're living with the symptoms of depression, and they're now adding on everything they think they know about depression. It's a tragedy. That's one of the main points I want to make, is the desire to get a diagnosis so that we can get them medicated, so that we can get like a treatment plan. The problem is that you're putting people in boxes with things that, and the same thing happens all the time with ADHD and these like sort of nebulous conditions. I think it happens with depression, anxiety, and so on. You just give the person more food to deepen them, to go deeper into the mud, basically. The next thing that I'm annoyed about is medication. Depression is a very widespread illness nowadays. And again, in my opinion, I don't think this is because it's actually more widespread. I really find that difficult to believe with some of the stuff that we've been through as a species, even in the last 100 years, or 100, 150 years with the world wars and all other kinds of stuff. I really find it hard to believe that depression is literally more widespread nowadays than ever. I think it's just because we're measuring it more and it's well understood and it's diagnosed and we've got medicine to treat it to some degree. Basically, the way the medical system works is it works on diagnosis and medication, right? So we've spoken about the diagnosis part. The immediate solution that I was given, right, is medication. That's what I was given. The doctor, they gave me a diagnosis, and as soon as I left, I had a prescription slip for my medication, right? Now listen, medication is proven to be useful, so I'm not denying that it's not useful. And it's widespread for a reason, right? I understand that. It's cost effective. It doesn't require 100 professionals to carry it out. It requires someone to prescribe it, and it requires a checkup every few months, and it requires that the patient keeps up. That's also an issue with it, but in my case, it wasn't an issue. I was keeping up with it every day. The problem is that when that is offered to you as the solution, it immediately creates a belief system in you, very implicitly, and it's a very subtle thing. But basically, how it makes you feel, it's sort of like when you have a cold, right? When you have a cold, I think we can all sort of agree that we all suffer colds, right? It's very unlikely that you're going to go through your entire life, even if you're a very healthy person, and you're not going to have colds, right? So think of a cold as something that inevitably you're going to catch no matter what happens, right? What do we do when we have a cold? We usually take some sort of medication. We take some like paracetamol to weaken the symptoms. We drink tea, we drink lots of water, we rest up, we take other medications to fight the actual virus itself, to kill the virus itself. So basically our solution is medication, mostly. Now, because that's how we're all we're brought up with a diagnosis that is medicated somehow. And if it's not medicated, it's like a disaster, right? Which is understandable. But the problem is that we see it as an external thing. We see it as a problem that is happening to us. When you catch a cold, you can understand it in that way, because maybe it literally has happened to you. It might have nothing to do with your diet, really. You might have a perfect diet. You might have a perfect health. It might, there might be no reason for it other than you were just around people that had the flu or the cold, right? So it happened to you to some degree, right? Okay. But the thing is with depression is that, yes, your environment has an impact. And yes, your past life experiences have an impact. Your social circles have an impact. Your habits have an impact, of course. But with depression, you are basically perpetuating it as well. That is something that I realize now, is that I was actually perpetuating it so much. And when someone gives you medication, the implicit thing they're saying is, this is something that's happening to you, and it's something that can only be solved by external means. And it's a very incomplete picture. I think overall, probably the medication helped. I mean, I don't know. I can't do a random controlled trial on myself, but it's proven to work. And placebo effect is a thing as well. But I did feel some days that things were probably better than they would have been without the medication, right? But that's the thing that annoys me here. When we medicate people automatically, to me, it implicitly, we don't say this to them, maybe, but it gives people an idea that this is something that's happening to you and you don't have much control over it. So we're just going to give you these pills because, that's all we can really do, right? That's the other thing I'm annoyed about, because looking back and after, as I said, the experience I have now, that just isn't the case with depression. I don't want to say that you create your depression yourself, and I'm not trying to put the burden on the depressed person, especially if they're not ready to hear about the responsibility they have. But to a large degree, the patient is responsible for it, in how they perpetuate their own thought cycles, in how they manage their emotions, in how they behave, and the habits they have. And that was never mentioned to me at all. So that's first two things I'm annoyed about, is the diagnosis and the medication treatment. Not because of the medication treatment in itself, but just because of the way that it's the first thing that we do for people. And in many cases, it's the only thing we do. And if you've had your own experience with the medical system, you'll probably know this for yourself, so I don't need to tell you. But this is often the only thing that is given to people. So, the next thing that I want to mention, and this is probably the most important point of this entire podcast that I'm making here, is that at no point in this entire process, and I saw a therapist for several months, and I was on medication, I went to see a doctor several times, at no point did I feel like anyone actually tried to help me. Let me explain this a little bit, right? At no point I had these treatments, and even in the therapy, this is the case. At no point did we actually sit down and say, this is my life. This is what is happening in my life right now. This is everything I do. This is the things that I've been through. This is my psychology. This is how I look at my life. These are the sort of thought patterns I'm having. These are the experiences I've had. This is what I've experienced in the past. And so on and so on and so on. At no point did we sit down and look at the whole thing and try to like deduce common themes and say, well, this is a pattern that I'm seeing here. You broke up with your girlfriend and now you're feeling depressed. Well, that might have been a trigger, right? That may have been a trigger for depression. Or, oh, you're having these thoughts all day, right? Is having these thoughts all day helping you? Can we help you see your thoughts in a different way by using some sort of therapy that directly addresses that? These are the dietary habits you've got. These are the drinking habits you've got. My dietary habits were terrible. My drinking habit was terrible. At no point did anyone sit down with me and look at that. Like at no point did, and this is what I said at the beginning, at no point did any of the professionals try to identify the actual cause of my depression. I'm not saying there's one cause, but I'm being serious. Nobody tried to help me figure that out, or even tried to help me understand the importance of doing that. At no point in the process was that done. It really, I do not understand it. Like, it really escapes me. It doesn't make sense to me at all. It just seems extremely counterproductive to me. It's like we were doing everything. I was taking medication. I was talking to this therapist about how I was thinking, how I was feeling, and blah, 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 what was going on in my life. But no one was actually giving me input. No one was giving me expertise in my own psychological issues. I didn't know what was going on. And no one even say to me at the time, Ross, you've been through a breakup and you were totally enamored with this girl. Like, what do you expect? Like, and look at your diet, look at your habits, look at your thought patterns. Like, look at these thoughts that you're having, and look at how you're buying into them, and look at how you have no tools whatsoever for dealing with them. It is just so baffling to me. I cannot understand why that is not done. To me, that is the main thing that needs to be done. And I'm not saying we sit down and we need to look at various areas, and I'm going to talk about this next week. We need to look at the entire person's life. We need to look at absolutely everything, all the factors possible. We need to try and help them understand what is going on, and we need to try and give them a solution to each of the things that are perpetuating their mental state. That is what we need to do. We don't need to give people medication. Maybe we need to give them medication as a way to buffer the symptoms for a while and to make them, just to get them on an even keel. And maybe we need to help, as I say, do this like talk therapy. We need to get all this stuff out, all this stuff that they can't express to anyone else, get it out. But then we need to actually educate people. That's what needs to happen. And that's the thing I'm pissed off about the most. I was never educated in my own depression, not in why it's happening, how I'm perpetuating it, what I can do about it on so many different levels. It doesn't involve going to a therapist. It doesn't involve fucking taking a pill, pardon my French, but it's just annoying, and it's just so, it seems very childish to me. I guess to conclude, the thing I'm pissed off about is how we see depression and our standard explanations for it. And there's basically two explanations for depression, right, that I commonly get from people. And you can apply this to many other things in life, and you might ask, well, why is this the case? And in my opinion, it is not a coincidence, but this is another topic for another day. The two explanations we give for depression are, it's a genetic issue, so it runs in the family. Depression runs in the family. So if you've got brothers and sisters, or mums and dads, or aunties and uncles, or grandmas and granddads who've had a history of depression, you're more likely to have depression, right? Okay. The second view we have of it is that it's a neurological imbalance. Don't you hear this all the time? It's like, oh, this person's, oh, they've got some sort of problem with their receptors, or their serotonin levels are low, or whatever it is, right? Some sort of neurological explanation, like some sort of chemical explanation. Right. Let me sum up very concisely before I go into a bit more depth on this. Let me sum up very concisely what my point of view on this is. Right. These two factors are just factors in a bigger story, the story of what depression is, why it exists, and what we can do about it. And in and of themselves, they are actually useless, and they are childish, very limited, very naive explanations of what depression is. I know that sounds harsh, but if you've experienced depression before and you've actually went through the process, you're not just learning about it in a book, in a fucking lecture theatre, you'll know that these are very naive explanations. Like, it's shockingly naive to think that the explanation for someone's depression is genetics, full stop, or it's neurological problems, full stop. Let me just explain, right? And I know the genetic explanation because I'm not going to name names or give away who it is or anything, it doesn't matter. People in my family, there is a branch of my family where a lot of people have suffered depression at various points, and there's a case of suicide, right? That's all I'm going to say, right? The belief amongst this branch of the family is that it's a genetic issue. The problem with this explanation, right? I'm not going to say there's no evidence for the genetic factor in depression. I'm not going to deny that. What I'm going to deny is, first of all, giving that as the only factor, right? And I'm going to deny the naive view we have of genetics, which is that it's something that is beyond our control entirely. Let me just say that there's an entire branch of genetics called epigenetics, which describes basically how, in order for genes to continue to impact our biology, our environment has an impact, our psychology and our life experiences have an impact. Everything that is coming into our system has an impact on our genes. I know that's very general, but take that as an idea, that epigenetics is a study of how genetic expression is altered by the environment and by the experiences of the human being and of the organism, if you want to go more general to all organisms that have genes. But that's one issue. Genetics isn't just like this. Our genes aren't just like this, this separate thing that has its own, a life of its own. It just does what it does. That's not how our genes work. And obviously there's many shades of grey and there's many nuances, and I'm not a genetics expert, right? But I'm just saying, and the reason I'm saying it is most people do not know this. And many things, including meditation, I might add, has been shown to alter genetic expression. So if you're going to come to me with your explanation for genetics, I'll say, well, maybe, I don't know, right? I'm not pretending to know all the nuances, but if you're going to put your mental health on genetics, you better do your research, and you better make sure that you're not altering your own genetic expression, and you better make sure that you're not doing it in a way that is messing up your psychology, right? If you believe so heavily in genetics, you better make sure that you know what you're talking about, and you better make sure that you're not using this to turn into some sort of victim of genetic destiny. We've all heard people talking about how, well, my dad had such and such disease, and well, I'm doomed. But when you actually look at the person's lifestyle, it's like, it probably wouldn't matter if your dad had it or not, because you live your life in such a way that you're kind of predisposing yourself to disease anyway. That's the problem with genetics. I know, I appreciate I'm sort of approaching this from an amateur point of view, right? But I just want you to see the problem. I'm not saying I know the entire solution. I'm just saying look at it from a bit of a more nuanced perspective. You can go away and do the research, right? I'm going to research this stuff more. What I found with the genetics explanation in many different areas of life, including like the topic of talent and so on, the idea of having genes for a certain sport and whatever, I find that the people who put these explanations forward are people that do not take action themselves. They don't look after themselves. And so they need this genetics explanation as a reason to kind of like deny and shun their own responsibility for what they're doing to themselves and how they're living their life. That's the problem with the genetics explanation. Again, it's like getting medication. It puts the attention away from you and all your habits and everything that you control in your life, which is so much. We're really appreciating this nowadays with the importance of diet and exercise. Just those two things are very important. You're putting all this power outside yourself, and it's sad. You know, I could sit here and say, oh, my dad has had depressive problems in the past, which he has. I could sit here and say my granddad has had depressive problems in the past, which I think he has, for a reason I'm not going to go into. I don't think it's necessary. I could sit here and moan about it. What would that do? It would only reinforce all the patterns that are mine, and it wouldn't give me the power to do everything I do to keep myself healthy and to keep myself mentally healthy. It would just take that power right away. Even if the genetics explanation is right, which I've given you a few very simple reasons that it's not right in and of itself, even if it was, it would still be a disaster because it still disempowers people to a shocking level. So that's one explanation we often have. Sorry for the rant. Our other explanation is this idea that it's a neurological imbalance. Right. To me, that it's a factor, but it's not the factor for the reason people think it is. To me, this is kind of like saying a fat person is fat because they have a lot of fat in their body. You see the problem here? It's like you're not explaining anything. You're just giving me a biological marker. That is all you're doing. That's literally like saying a fat person is fat because they have fat in their body. And people take this to be an explanation for depression. It doesn't explain anything. It's like saying you're happy because you experience like God, I can't remember right now. You're experiencing the chemicals of happiness. That doesn't explain anything. How does that explain anything? It doesn't explain the person's habits, it doesn't explain their psychology, it doesn't explain their life situation, it doesn't explain all the million factors that actually produce happiness in people. And yes, biology, of course, there's a biological correlate to all this. The biological correlate of being fat is having lots of fat in the body, of having high blood pressure, of having high salt, of having terrible cardiovascular condition, of being overweight. That is all the biological correlate of being fat. In the same way that when you're depressed, yes, you're going to have certain neurochemicals are lower, right? But that it doesn't explain anything to me. And again, like the genetics nonsense and like the medicine nonsense, you are disempowering people because you're saying you're fat because you've got lots of fat in your body. Goodbye, see you later. You're depressed because you've got low levels of serotonin in your brain. Right, well, that sounds very abstract. What on earth can I do? And then you realise that when you research this a bit more, you realise everything you do is affecting your neurochemistry, everything you do is affecting your neurobiology, everything you do sets off chemicals in your body. Everything that we do impacts our entire body, it impacts our biology, our psychology, our chemistry, everything is affected by it. And so when you say that to people, you're giving them such a narrow, naive, childish perspective on depression. And that is ultimately what I'm pissed off about with the medical system, that in pretty much every case, even in depression, which is primarily a psychological thing. Obviously it has behavioural effects, it has biological effects, yes, of course, but it's primarily psychological. We're giving them these very naive explanations, and this is what people think, because this is how the medical system views it. We view it as, oh, it's happening to us. I'm depressed because I've got low neurotransmitter, whatever it is, and I'm depressed because of my genetic destiny. Listen, that might be an impact. That might have an impact it might be literally the only explanation in some very small cases, in very isolated cases, but I'm going to put myself on the line here and say 99% of cases, those are not the actual fundamental causes of your depression. Again, I'm going to put the disclaimer out. I'm not a mental health professional. This is not mental health advice. I am a patient. I am a student of psychology. I'm a meditation teacher. And I've read a lot about this stuff. And I'll say that probably, I'm guessing, in 99% of cases, genetics and neurobiology is not the fundamental cause of depression. Anyway, I think I'm going to leave it there, because that is a lot of material. And next week I'm going to be back with if this isn't the right view of depression, if this isn't the right way to treat it, what is the right way? And I'm going to give for what it's worth, my explanation of what I think, how I think we need to look at depression, and how I think we need to treat depression. Alright, thank you everyone. Please do support me on Patreon if you enjoy this podcast. It would really mean a lot. This, along with the website, along with my classes, this is my full-time work, this is my livelihood. And it costs me money and time to create this. I love it, but the support is also very great. So please check out my Patreon page and consider subscribing. And of course, head to deep-psychology.com for lots of free resources. And I will see you next week with the next installment in this little series on depression.
Thanks for listening. If you liked this episode, please leave a review. And if you'd like to get in touch, you can email me at ross@deep-psychology.com. If you'd like to go deeper, head to deep-psychology.com for articles, courses, ebooks, and one-to-one coaching. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you soon.